Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. Heather wasn't dead. And the truth hit Genoa City like a big crack in the ground, breaking up all the old hurt that had been hiding for years. On a rainy evening, Daniel was alone in the penthouse, thinking about the future he had hoped for with Tessa. Soft music playing, wedding plans half made, love stitched together with hope. Then there was a knock at the door. It didn't sound like fate, but like something that had been waiting a long time. When he opened the door, the woman he had grieved, buried, and blamed himself for losing stood there, alive, breathing, trembling. Her hair was darker, her eyes sharper, and her body carried the marks of everything she had gone through. The world felt like it had tilted. Heather Baldwin stepped forward and said his name, as if no time had passed, as if she hadn't disappeared into sadness and tragedy, as if she hadn't been a ghost in his mind. Daniel's knees nearly gave out because the mind can't believe that someone who was thought to be dead is still alive. She was real, fragile, and angry. Before he could speak, before he could ask how or why she was back, she said she only had 3 things to say, and then she would leave forever. She hadn't come back to take anything back, but to tell the truth. The first thing she said was that Lucy was never just a memory or something that had ended. Lucy was proof of a promise Daniel had made and quietly broken. While he was building a new life with Tessa, he had been rewriting the past to make it easier to live. He had been pretending that Heather's disappearance was the end, when in fact it had been a sacrifice. She had stayed away to protect Lucy from people Daniel didn't even know were after them. Every birthday he missed and every milestone he didn't see had been paid for with Heather's fear and blood. Daniel felt the ground crack under the weight of it because Tessa, standing frozen in the hallway, heard everything and realized the man she loved had a big silence inside him. Heather's second message came like a soft knife. She said that Daniel hadn't just moved on after she was gone. He had erased her. He had chosen love again, not because he had healed but because he was running. It was easier to build something new than to deal with the guilt of unfinished promises. She looked straight at Tessa when she said this, not with hate, but with a truth that cut deeper than anger. She told her she wasn't the problem. She was just the distraction, the place Daniel went to hide when the past was too loud. Tessa felt something inside her break, because love should never feel like a place to hide from someone else's pain. Daniel tried to protest, tried to explain that love isn't a zero-sum game, and that grief shouldn't control the future. But Heather raised her hand and said the third thing, the one that broke him completely. She told him that the night she disappeared, the night everyone thought she was dead, she had heard him on the phone saying he couldn't wait anymore, that he needed to live, and that he needed to let go. Those words had been spoken in exhaustion and fear, not cruelty, but they had convinced her that staying gone was the only way to free him. She told him that every step he took toward Tessa had been built on a misunderstanding she carried like a death sentence. The realization left him feeling empty because love had been built on silence and sacrifice instead of choice. Tessa, with tears on her face, finally spoke and said she couldn't marry a man whose heart was still dealing with ghosts. She couldn't be the woman who profited from another's disappearance. She couldn't build a future on a broken foundation of secrets. Daniel, torn between the woman he loved and the woman who had never stopped loving him from the shadows, realized in that moment that sometimes truth doesn't bring people back together. It changes them. Heather stepped back into the rain after saying she didn't want him back, didn't want apologies, only wanted him to live honestly from now on. As the door closed and the silence roared, Daniel realized that love had made him pay a price he could no longer ignore. Breaking up with Tessa wasn't about choosing Heather, it was about choosing truth. And Genoa City would never see death, love, or endings the same way again now that the woman they had buried had returned to say 3 things that changed everything forever. The next chapter started in the heavy silence after the truth came out. Genoa City woke up to rumors that wouldn't go away, because Heather Baldwin's return didn't stay inside Daniel's broken penthouse. It spread everywhere like ink in water, darkening conversations at Crimson Lights, stopping meetings at Chancellor Winter's, and shaking up the Newman Ranch. As morning came, Daniel sat alone on his bed, replaying the night over and over in his mind. Heather's voice, Tessa's tears, and the sound of a door closing not in anger but in sadness. His phone kept buzzing with messages he didn't have the courage to read, because facing the real world felt impossible when he could barely face himself. But the city wouldn't let him hide. By noon, Phyllis stormed into the penthouse demanding answers, her anger fierce like a mother who knows danger is coming before it hits. She was relieved Heather was alive, but furious about the damage done. Daniel could only look at her with empty eyes and admit he lost Tessa not to another woman, but to the truth. Phyllis was stunned for a moment, but her motherly instincts kicked in and she promised to protect him, even if it meant tearing down relationships across the city. Meanwhile, Tessa packed her bags with shaking hands, each folded shirt feeling like a betrayal of the future she thought she had. Mariah watched helplessly as the woman she loved fell apart, because of someone who belonged to a past that wasn't finished. When Mariah asked if there was still a chance, Tessa answered with one broken sentence. Loving Daniel had taught her that sometimes you don't lose a person, you just lose the timing, and timing can be crueler than any villain. Across town, Heather stood at the edge of the city she once called home, watching from a distance as the consequences of her return spread. She hadn't come back to take over, but to fix a mistake that had cost everyone years. Yet she wasn't ready for the way seeing Daniel again made her feel. Emotions she had hidden under survival were cracking open. Guilt started to eat at her as she realized her silence had shaped other people's lives in ways she never meant. When Lucy finally saw her mother alive for the first time, the moment was full of tears and disbelief, and a child's honest question. Why does love always disappear? Heather couldn't answer without breaking down, because how do you tell a child that adults sometimes confuse sacrifice with abandonment? As that fragile moment happened, the power players of Genoa City started thinking about what was coming next. Victor Newman quietly ordered his security team to look into Heather's disappearance because nothing in his city ever stayed simple. Nikki sensed old secrets tied to forgotten enemies might come back now that a presumed dead woman was back in the light. Jack Abbott watched from a distance with worry in his silence, knowing how love and guilt can rot from the inside out. As the hours passed, Daniel realized that ending things with Tessa hadn't brought peace, only more pain. Choosing honesty didn't erase love. It just stripped it of lies. When he finally said goodbye to Tessa properly, the silence between them was heavy with everything they couldn't change. There were no accusations left, only shared sadness over a future that would never happen. Their goodbye was quiet and painful in its simplicity. A final touch of hands that lingered just long enough to acknowledge what was lost without reopening the wound. After she left, Daniel collapsed into sobs that came not just from heartbreak, but from losing his sense of who he was. He had lived inside lies he didn't even know he was using. Meanwhile, Heather was trying to understand her own return, realizing that coming back to life didn't mean getting the past back. It meant dealing with the consequences of changing it. When she ran into Tessa by accident at Crimson Lights, the tension between them was thick, but instead of fighting, there was a moment of understanding. Two women, both connected to the same man but split by time. Heather's quiet apology, spoken not for loving Daniel, but for the pain she caused, felt like a fragile truce. Tessa was shaken but strangely lighter, as if forgiveness, even if it wasn't complete, had eased something in her heart. As Genoa City prepared for what was next, rumors began to swirl that Heather's disappearance wasn't an accident but part of a conspiracy long buried. One that could put her and Lucy in danger again. That forced Daniel to step into protector mode. Not as a lover, but as a father determined not to repeat the mistakes of silence and distance. In the final hours of the chapter, as night returned to a city that never truly sleeps, Daniel stood alone on the balcony, looking out over the lights. He realized Heather's return hadn't ended one story, but begun several more. Love had been revealed, truth had changed loyalties, and the real shock wasn't that Heather wasn't dead, but that everyone else now had to live honestly in the aftermath. The stage was set for alliances to break, secrets to come out, and a reckoning that would test every relationship in Genoa City, as the past refused to stay hidden and the future demanded to be faced without lies. The next chapter opened with the city holding its breath, because Genoa City never tolerated loose ends for long, and Heather Baldwin walking back from the dead had torn open a seam that refused to be stitched closed, beginning with the unsettling realization that she had not merely survived an accident but escaped a carefully engineered disappearance. And as Daniel stood beside Lucy in the aftermath of tearful reunions and fragile smiles, he felt the weight of fatherhood settle differently now. Not as a role postponed but as a reckoning overdue, while Heather, watching them together, understood with painful clarity that bringing truth into the light did not automatically grant her a place within it, because the life Daniel had built, then lost, and now stood rebuilding piece by piece, could never simply reverse itself, and yet danger crept closer with every unanswered question, because Victor Newman's quiet investigation began to surface names that should have remained buried. Shell companies dissolved overnight, security footage wiped too clean to be coincidence, and a single phrase repeated in old reports: witness protection declined. That made Nikki's blood run cold, while Phyllis, ever the storm, demanded to know who had decided Heather needed to disappear in the first place and why no one had ever been told the truth, her fury colliding with guilt as she realized how many assumptions she herself had accepted without question. And as the city buzzed with speculation, Tessa attempted to step back into a version of normalcy that felt alien. Every song she tried to write collapsing under the weight of emotions she no longer knew how to name, because losing Daniel had not erased love, it had simply removed permission to express it, and Mariah watched helplessly as Tessa smiled for the world while breaking quietly behind closed doors, wondering whether love always required someone else to lose for it to survive. While meanwhile Heather received a message that turned her blood to ice. A simple note slipped under her hotel door that read, "You should have stayed dead." Written in a hand she recognized from a past she had spent years running from, and suddenly survival stopped feeling like victory and started feeling like a countdown, forcing her to confess to Daniel the truth she had avoided even in her 3 revelations, that her disappearance had been orchestrated by someone inside Genoa City's power structure, someone who believed she knew too much, and was willing to erase her existence to keep a secret intact. And Daniel, rage simmering beneath his shock, realized that loving Heather once had nearly destroyed him, but losing her twice would finish the job, and so he stepped into a role he had long resisted, becoming not just a man searching for closure but a father and protector willing to burn down walls to keep his family safe, while Victor, sensing a larger game at play, warned him that truth often demanded blood as payment. Advice that landed like prophecy when Lucy was nearly taken outside her school in an incident brushed off publicly as confusion but privately confirmed as a test, and the city shifted from gossip to fear as alliances hardened and old enemies stirred, forcing Jack Abbott to intervene when corporate ties connected to the disappearance began threatening innocent people, while Sharon sensed emotional fractures forming across the community, offering counsel that rang hollow against the reality that some wounds could not be healed through understanding alone. And as Heather faced the unbearable guilt of realizing her return had placed Lucy in danger, she prepared to leave again, believing disappearance was still the only way to protect her child, only to be stopped by Daniel's quiet declaration that running had already stolen enough years from all of them, and that this time they would face the truth together no matter the cost. Words that did not promise romance or reunion but something far more fragile and profound: shared responsibility. And across town Tessa overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear, revealing that her own career resurgence was quietly funded by the same shadowy entity now circling Heather, a revelation that made her question whether even her independence had been curated by unseen hands. And when she confronted Daniel not with accusation but fear, the space between them shifted again, because trust, once cracked, never returns to its original shape, but it can still exist in altered form. And as the chapter closed with a city bracing for impact, Heather stood beneath the night sky realizing that surviving death was the easy part, because living meant staying, facing enemies, accepting consequences, and watching the people you love make choices you can no longer control, while Daniel understood that breaking up with Tessa had not ended his pain but clarified his purpose, because the real battle was no longer about love triangles or missed timing. It was about exposing the truth that had stolen years, manipulated hearts, and nearly erased a woman's existence. And as Genoa City's lights flickered like warning signals in the dark, one truth became unavoidable. Heather Baldwin's return was not the end of the story. It was the spark that would set the city on fire. Genoa City braced itself as the truth tightened its grip, because Heather Baldwin's return no longer felt like a miracle but a warning. And in the uneasy calm after near-disaster, Daniel stood between past and future with Lucy's hand in his, realizing that being a father now meant refusing to let fear dictate silence ever again, while Heather, shaken by the threat that nearly stole her child, finally admitted that her disappearance had been forced by someone powerful enough to erase paper trails, and patient enough to wait years to finish the job, a confession that sent a chill through Daniel as Victor Newman quietly confirmed his worst suspicions that this was never just about one woman but about secrets worth killing for. And as investigators circled closer, Phyllis burned with rage at the idea that her family had been collateral damage in someone else's game, while Jack Abbott recognized the familiar stench of corporate corruption masquerading as protection, and across town Tessa tried to outrun the emotional wreckage by throwing herself into music only to discover that even her career carried fingerprints of manipulation she never consented to, forcing her to confront the terrifying idea that independence could be an illusion crafted by unseen hands. And when she crossed paths with Daniel again, there was no romance left to mourn, only a shared understanding that truth had a way of stripping love down to its rawest form. And Heather, watching them from a distance, understood that her return had not reunited hearts but rearranged destinies, because Daniel's choice was no longer about who he loved but about what kind of man he would be now that lies had been burned away. And as Lucy asked questions no child should have to ask about danger and disappearance, Heather felt the crushing guilt of realizing survival alone was not enough if it came at the cost of stability. Yet when she prepared to leave once more, Daniel stopped her with a quiet resolve that cut deeper than passion, insisting that running had already stolen too much and that this time they would face whatever came together, not as lovers chasing the past but as parents protecting the future. And as night fell over Genoa City with rumors spreading faster than facts, it became clear that Heather's resurrection had triggered something far larger than heartbreak, because enemies were watching, alliances were shifting, and the city itself seemed to sense that another reckoning was coming, one where truth would demand sacrifice. Love would be tested without illusion, and no one, especially those who believed they controlled the shadows, would remain untouched by the consequences of bringing a dead woman back to life.